All right, so thank you for being here for another night of church history. Let's start off with a prayer and then we'll get into the lecture. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this evening. Lord, I thank you so much for each person who is here this evening. I ask you to be with those who can't be here for whatever reason. Lord, I pray that you will be with each one. I pray that you will open their minds, open their ability to read Fox's Book of Martyrs. Lord, I ask that you allow them to understand, to ingest, Lord, that it would just speak to them, Lord, that you would use it as a way to grow closer to you. Lord, I thank you so much for everyone's willingness, for their dedication, for their willingness to be away from their families for an hour and a half whenever they don't have to be. Lord, I just thank you so much for all you're doing in this class and what you're going to do with each person in their future. We thank you and we love you and we ask it all in Christ's name. Amen. All right. So we have a little bit to make up from last lecture because I ran short on time. So we're going to do a little melding. So remember the last class we ended by talking about the Crusades. And we were talking about the privileges or the what the church was offering to people as individuals to motivate them to become a crusader or to join a crusade. We talked about those spiritual privileges and those civil privileges. And while those were very beneficial for the people that were taking advantage of them, it also tended to bring in people who were not always of high moral quality. I guess that's the best way to put it. So because a lot of the civil privileges that were extended included having your record expunged, having all of your, civil sins forgiven, no more taxes, all of these things that are coming in, especially for a person who has been arrested, has been in jail or prison, to have an opportunity to start over with a clean slate, that's an awesome opportunity. However, if it's only used as an opportunity to get something for oneself, then as those people entered into the Crusades, they sometimes were the most violent and least, yes, they did it for reasons other than trying to accomplish the missions that the Crusades intended to set out. Even the popes who were, by and large, responsible for beginning each crusade, it was never their vision to have the violence erupt that did come out of it. So, anyway, so those were the Crusades. So, this period of the Crusades, we're going to start on this side on this black lettering first. This period of the Crusades, it ended up being a revival for monasticism. Now remember that the monasteries, they had been forming whenever individuals were being challenged by their environment. So they were maybe going into the churches and seeing corruption, or maybe going into their homes and finding that their children were morally degraded, or whatever. They're just having issues. The places they worked, people were not godly people. And so they decided to separate completely from society and physically separate from society and from the church, but not from the Lord. And they would go out into these, first it started out being individuals, and then those individuals ended up forming into what we call cloisters, and eventually became monasteries, and they were, growing their own food, and they were having their own sort of class work, so to speak, and all these things, right? So it just became more organized. Well, monasticism, while it was looked upon for a long time as, it was highly regarded because, wow, look what you have to do to be a monk and to live this lifestyle, but not necessarily elevated in society. At the time of the Crusades, the monks and the monkeries, they began to become elevated. It began to be something of a privilege to be a monk, instead of just something that you stood back away from and said, "Wow, look what those guys are doing," and then you just move on with your life. These people were wanting to become, and they wanted to be part of the monasteries because they were being elevated. Well, the monks, by this time, were playing major roles in society, because one reason was because they were absolutely supported by the church. they were part of the chief promoters of the Crusades. The monks would rally people together. They would have talks. They would explain what would happen. They would explain those privileges that they could extend or that would be extended to people. And so they helped to rally people. But interestingly, they became teachers in what became universities. So universities didn't start off being universities. They started off being these cathedrals. They would be a place where men would gather to discuss a certain subject, with one person in particular kind of being someone who was learned about that subject. So a teacher, basically, right? So these cathedrals, they were educational centers or places where people would meet. Sometimes they would go to a certain building to have a meeting. Sometimes it was just the gathering of certain men wherever they happened to be, and that was considered a cathedral. So these cathedrals, if you look it up online, there's actually a lot of interesting variety that is said about these cathedrals and how they were put together and the impact they had on society and whatever. But you can look that up if you're interested. What's interesting, though, is that these cathedrals, they had two separate, they didn't start off this way, but they ended up sort of forming two units. They formed more of a religious or spiritual unit that the monastic, the monks were in charge of or ran. But then they also ended up forming sort of this secular group. Now, when I say secular, it doesn't mean the same thing then that it means now. When you say secular university, it means without, like it's completely... it doesn't mean that at this time, it didn't mean that God was completely removed from the teaching. God was still the center of everything in this society. But the monastic side, they are more like, this is our lifestyle. This is what we do to help the people. This is why we are monks. You know, we grow our own food. We give all our money to the poor. We work the land. We do this, we do that. The secular side was more about who is God? How do we learn more about God? And they extended outside of the monasteries and went into the community. And so anybody who maybe met the criteria, I don't know if that would be a fee or I don't know, but anyone who was interested and met the criteria could come in and meet and be a part of the secular meetings at these cathedrals. And they would, which is something they wouldn't be able to do in the monasteries. So the secular side was kind of involving the community more, okay? Now, and that's a very brief overview. It's not absolute. That's not the only dividing line, but that's just kind of an overview. Something interesting came out of this. So these cathedrals eventually, especially these groups of men who would meet, that's what ended up being forming universities as we know it today. The cathedrals just sort of naturally moved into and became universities. That's just so you'll know that. But this idea of scholasticism, there was an entire chapter in your book devoted to scholasticism. But really what I want you to know about it is scholasticism's main goal is to take the theology, which is the study of who is God, you know, how do we learn more? How do we get closer? To reconcile theology with human reason. Now, most people believed, that's what this is, most people saw the idea of reason and the idea of theology as being opposing views. Like they contradict each other, they fight with each other, they're aggressive with each other, whatever. But this man, Thomas Aquinas, he wrote a book, and his idea was that, no, these two things are by no means contradictory. They are in fellowship with one another. His entire idea is summed up in this sentence, that revelation or understanding what God puts forth could guide reason and prevent it from making mistakes. So when God is in control, then what you do is straight. But reason can help clarify the things that when people think of theology or they think of God, the things of God, they're like, oh, that's just too much for me. It's mystical. It's this, it's this thing that I can't wrap my head around. Human reason can help demystify those things about theology and about understanding who God is, and they can work together and come to the same conclusion, come to the same goal. So that was Thomas Aquinas's. That was his whole idea behind the book that he wrote. So it's interesting. In his time, this is a little bit of a harsh word, but he was kind of a radical. I mean, this was just not something, these two things were separate, and he was just like, no, they're not separate. So he met quite a bit of opposition. All right. Now, so this is still sort of tying in the Crusades, tying in the feel or the emotion of the time. So do you remember when we were talking early on how the church formed, and then, and I think we talked about how it popped up in Alexandria, how the bishops were talking and they were preaching the word of God. They were spreading the gospel, the bishops in Alexandria. And then along comes this man and he says, no. That's not who Christ is. Christ is not really the Son of God. Christ is not really God. Christ is this, or Jesus is that, and they start changing it just a little bit, right? And this first man that we talked about was Arius, right? And he caused such a big controversy at the time that Constantine took over the empire, that Constantine, who was trying to use Christianity to pull everybody together, right? And then you have within the church, you have these people fighting with each other and all this dissension happening. So what does he do? He calls that big council, and he pays for all the pastors in the whole empire to go up to Nicaea, and they meet and they have this council and they talk about lots of stuff, but it was called because of heresy. It was because of Arius and all of his business and what he was talking about and how he was changing who Jesus is. And Constantine basically said, look, I don't really care what the end of the day is, but you guys need to stop fighting. So get it together and come up with something and let's move forward. So they did, and they declared him a heretic, right? So see how that heresy sort of helped define who we are as Christians. Like before that, we had an idea, but because there were attacks coming from the outside, the church had to further define itself and had to say, oh, no, this is who Christ is. This is who we are. And this is not allowed in the Church of Jesus Christ, right? So same thing is still happening. It's just not Arius this time, right? So your book talks about a few of these. So let's, first of all, these early Christians, like what I was just talking about, they defined heresy as the denial of Christ and the denial of Christ's doctrines, right? That's it. That was heresy. By the Middle Ages or by the medieval times, these Christians said, yes, it is definitely the denial of Christ and the doctrine, but it's also disobedience to the established Christian authority. Okay?
Does it say mid-what Christians?
It says medieval, but you can, but Middle Ages, the Middle Age Christians, right? Yeah, I'm sorry that medieval. So they have taken it and added to it just a little bit, saying, yes, do not deny Christ, do not deny his doctrines, but also do not be disobedient to the authorities that have been put into place. Okay? So, with that being in mind, the book talked about these three guys, talked about this man, Arnold. Each of these guys was declared a heretic. So Arnold, his heresy is that he said, if you have any wealth or any power, you're going to lose your salvation. I mean, it was a cut and dry situation with him. If you had money, you're out of here. If you had any sort of power or influence, you're out, right? That is not the heart of God. So he was declared a heretic. Well, then Waldo comes along, and he's initially, or like on the surface, he's got some pretty good things happening. He's like, let's return to the Bible, let's return to Scripture, let's live our lives like Christians. And remember, this is in a time of monasticism being really exciting and the thing to do. So let's go back and live a life of poverty, right? Chastity and poverty. The problem with Waldo is that he had no grace in anything that he said. He was very strict. He was very harsh. And that, again, is not the word of God. We learned from the Crusades that forcing, violence, yelling, and that attitude, it does not convert people at all. So he was just, kind of starting on the right path, but just had absolutely no grace involved in what he was in what he was teaching or what he believed. And then this Cathari, this group of people came along, and this is very similar to heresy that we've already discussed, where you have the flesh is evil and the spirit is good. And again, changing who Christ is, changing and saying, well, the God of the Old Testament, that's the mean, judgy, harsh, whatever God of the Old Testament. But the God of the New Testament, he's spirit. That's our Jesus. He's spirit. He never would have become flesh. And he never would have been put on a cross and been, treated that way. Like that was that was basically what they thought. And interestingly enough, Isaac was asking about Old Testament kind of being brought in. I mean, the Old Testament is just sprinkled with the idea. It's very clear that the Messiah that the Lord presents as a Savior must die. It's very clear. But if you reject, this idea of the Old Testament, because it's difficult. I mean, it's difficult to get through some of it because it does seem harsh. But we are not holy people. And he is a holy God. So, there you go. Anyway, so this Cathari, we're kind of still spreading that same flavor of heresy through. Well, the church needed to combat this heresy in much the same way it has combated a heresy in the past. And it has this two-part plan, okay? So first, they want to convert the heretic. And second, they want to protect the Christian. Both the Christian as a person, like the individual, and society as a Christian society. Okay, so it's kind of So when you say Christian, it's the individual and the society, right? The morality of the society. So how did the church go about trying to accomplish this? All right, does everybody have everything they need? Yep.
What year is it?
Really?
What time frame is this happening? I mean, I know I can look it up at home.
It's okay. Well, so the entire Christian Middle Ages was about 600 or so to, I don't know, probably, to 1517 when the Reformation happens. 1517. So about 600 to 1517. The Crusades themselves, though, they were just a small part of... They were just kind of coming up on the end.
1095 or what?
Yes. I want to give the right years.
It's on the little, is it on the little graph in the book?
Yes, 1095 to 1291 is basically the time frame. Good job.
I got it right here in my notes.
Oh, you. How did you know that? No, I'm just kidding. Okay. I know. See, well, anyway. All right. I'll just stop. All right. So, let's talk about these two ways, or these two approaches to...
Now, you had that Summa Theologica on the bottom?
Yeah. That's just the book. It's just that was just his book that he wrote. The most I would ever say about that is maybe a bonus question. It's not something that I am expecting you to know. I won't. Yeah. So if anything, it will help you, but not hurt you if you know it. All right. So how is he going to do this? Okay. So let's talk about converting the heretic first. All right, so there was a man, his name is Dominic, Dominic, Guzman. This man is the founder of what we know as the Dominicans, okay? The monastic group of the Dominicans. Oops. Mm-hmm. He was able to successfully convert some of the members of some of the Cathari using this idea of truth, but sprinkled with grace and love. the interesting thing is, in order to convert the heretic, one of the things that the church used was something known as the Inquisition. Inquisition. Now, before we go any further, there's actually two Inquisitions, and I'm going to define them very, very superficially, but I just want to make sure that in your mind you're clear that there are two separate Inquisitions, okay? The Inquisition we're going to be talking about in this time frame is what's known as the Holy Inquisition. Sometimes it's referred to as the Pontifical, but Holy Inquisition. These dates, again, you don't have to memorize the dates, it's just as a time frame. The second Inquisition is the one that most people have heard of or have some understanding of, and that is the Spanish Inquisition. That happened a few hundred years later, 1478, 1834. So there's two different Inquisitions, and so we're not going to go into detail about really either of them right now, but just realize that when you say the Inquisition, most people are talking about this one, but realize that there are actually two, okay? So this Holy Inquisition. So the idea here was to go out and find those who had strayed away from the Lord and try to, I guess for lack of a better word, convert those who don't know the Lord yet into the Christian society. So it was a twofold. And that's sort of like covering both of these anyway. It's converting one or bringing one back and then protecting one that's already there. It's interesting. There were rules. Okay, so first of all, I mentioned the Dominicans because the Pope used the Dominicans as inquisitors. Okay? So the people that were in the Dominican monasteries, that sect of the monastic societies, the Pope used the Dominicans as his inquisitors, meaning that the Dominicans would be the ones that would ask the questions. Okay? So it's interesting, when the inquisitors would go out, they would ask you the question, are you a Christian? If you claimed Christianity, they took you into a room to talk to you. It wasn't the heretics. It wasn't the people saying, nah, I'm a pagan, blah, blah, blah. That was a different... something else was going on with them. What they were doing was they were trying to make sure that those who were claiming Christianity were actually living a Christian life. So if you claimed it, you ended up going into a further inquisition with whoever it was that stopped you. Okay? The questions that were asked were used to convert. They were not supposed to be used to threaten or force or coerce or anything like that. They were supposed to be, again, they're supposed to be Christian words of love to bring people closer to Christ, not force them to do something that they're not even sure they understand or whatever. So the questions were supposed to be used to convert people and therefore save them, especially those who had kind of erred off and needed to be brought back in. However, even though the questions were supposed to be have a positive result, torture was still allowed. Now, it's interesting because the torture was allowed to go as far as the Roman government would allow torture to go within its civil authorities, okay? So the church basically used the same boundaries that the government used, okay? So it was allowed as it was under Roman law. But, of course, just like with the Crusades, you're always going to have those people that show up that are just really excited to just go out and cause some damage. Well, the same thing happens. I mean, people are people are people are people. And there were people who were part of this sect, this monastery, who were brought in as inquisitors who pushed things too far and did things they shouldn't have done and got a little bit violent. So, and at the same time, there were also people who left the order because they did not want to have any part of being inquisitors. So it was interesting. I mean, it just kind of depends. And I mean, it's not that surprising if you think about it in terms of even now, people will run to join the military because, not necessarily because they want to kill everybody, but that's what they want. They want to be in service and they want to protect the country or protect their family, right? But then there are other people who even at one time would go to another country in order to avoid being a part of that system. And it's the same thing. I mean, there are some people who just kind of throw their arms around the idea of military style life and the way that is enforced. And then there are people who are completely like, I'm not going to be doing that. I'm not a part of that at all. So to me, it's just more of the same human nature. Okay. That's not in your books. That's just me talking, by the way. So that is certainly an opinion. You do not have to agree with it. And you certainly won't be tested on that. This Inquisition, in order to convert the heretic, what was used were these Dominicans by the Pope to inquire, and when you find somebody who's claiming Christianity, make sure that they are, and if they're not, hopefully gently bring them back into the faith. Or if you're a little crazy, get a little violent with them, because that happened too. It happened. All right. Now, as far as protecting the Christian society, so if you're going to protect the society, this was all in your book. I'm not going to go into this too much, but this whole idea of lady poverty. Okay. Now, there was a second order that was, so the Dominicans were kind of on the Inquisition side of things just because they were used the way that they were used. This lady poverty, I don't know if you guys had a chance to read that story in the book or not, but how they sought after her and they found her on a lonely mountain by herself. She had been abandoned by all that she loved, and so she was desolate and alone. And
Was it a Thomas that married her?
sorry again?
Who married her?
It was, I don't know if he married her. It was Francis of Assisi.
Oh,
Francis.
He married.
Yes. Oh, yes, because he married poverty. Yes. That's right. So Francis of Assisi, that's right. So anyway, so this whole idea of embracing poverty, marrying poverty, for the result of, not for the sake of being poor, but for the sake of ridding yourself of everything that can remove you from the Lord, right? So that's very much like what you saw with Anthony and all of the first monks. So you had the Dominicans on not one side as in fighting with each other, but on one portion you had the Dominicans who were kind of the mafia, if you want to think of it. They're the kind of, they're kind of cold, and for lack of a better term, they're systematic, they're orderly, they're militaristic on some level. When you compare them to the Franciscan order, who was, they're very, very gentle. They're all about mingling with the people and getting everyone involved in everything and community service. And not that the Dominicans were not involved with the people. They loved the people too, but they were so involved with the papacy, with the Pope and under the Pope. And like a military, the military leaders don't go out among the people and hang out and talk about farming. They're there to protect. But you know what I'm saying? They just served two different roles. They were very different. But those two orders, even though they were strikingly different from one another, they still had some very similar characteristics to one another. They both believed in absolute poverty. They believed in going out and begging for what they needed, and they would only take exactly what they needed to survive, and everything else they got from begging, they gave to the poor. There's a term for it, mendicant. It talks about it in the Bible, in the church history book. So both of those believed in absolute poverty. They believed in the practical activities of society, like farming and building, and if a man is going to eat, he needs to work. Those sorts of biblical principles. They both allowed lay people to join the brotherhood. People who were not monks were allowed to help do work for and with the monastery. That was unique to them. Both of them were teachers in universities, and both were very, 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 very fully allegiant to the Pope. So the Pope fully supported them, and they were fully loyal to. And when I say the Pope, what I'm saying is the Church. Right? So the Dominicans and the Franciscans. All right. Now, as it turns out, as this kept going, like I said, the monasteries were sort of being elevated. People were looking at the monks and at the monasteries and going, ooh, I wish I could do that, instead of just being in awe and walking away. They're looking at it going, ooh, that's what I want my child to do. I'm going to raise my child, and I want that. I mean, it was just something that was sought after. Because the people, again, it's an interesting theme. We saw this happening with the church at Rome whenever the Huns and the Vandals were attacking. The people, really, really rallied around the Pope, and they were like, where is Eastern Orthodoxy? Why aren't they helping us? Like, where's Constantinople, right? Well, the same thing happens here. The people really love the monasteries. They really love the monks, and they love the interaction they have with them, the learning that they give, everything, right? And so this interesting shift started to take place, where the spiritual authority was most definitely within the church, within the papacy, but it was sort of leaving and going into the monkeries. Like, the people were going to the monks for spiritual guidance. They were going to, do you know what I mean? Like, it was starting to shift, because the monks, especially the monks like the Franciscans, they were so people oriented, and they did so much for the people around them. Everything they gave, they worked and gave everything they had to society to help make it better. So the people loved them. And so there kind of started being this shift, and you can see a reaction to it somewhat. Whenever we talked about Innocent III, Pope Innocent III last week, he actually put out a decree at one point near the end of his time in the papacy, where no more monasteries could be formed. Part of that was financial. Part of it was a financial issue. But part of it, and this is, again, sort of a personal sort of feeling flavor that I've gotten reading just a few of the things, part of it, I think, was because there was a threat. There was a little bit of a feeling, a threat coming, where the people were starting to move away from the church, not away from the Lord, but kind of away from the church and into the monasteries for their guidance. And that's just not okay. And it's funny, because as soon as the same year that Innocent went out of power, that's when the Dominican monastery officially formed. I mean, that's when they were actually officially formed. So anyway, whatever. Just a little bit of a side note. All right, so in the last little bit of time we have here, I want to talk about the decline of the papacy. We start having some issues coming in, and some consequences to those issues. I'm just going to talk about just a little bit of it. All right, so at the time, let's see, what is this, 1294? This is, again, just a reference. I'm not going to test you over it. The Pope in power at this time, his name is Boniface the 8th. Okay? So Boniface came into leadership, and he very much agreed with the precedents that had been set by Innocent III. Remember that Innocent III had started to really enforce the idea of papal supremacy, especially over the people, but even over the government, right? And Boniface very much was in agreement with that. He declared at one time, I am Caesar, I am emperor. his authority rested on this idea. His authority rested on the idea of Christendom being successful, this marriage between the state and the church, but with the church being the ultimate authority. So it's a marriage, but he's the husband. The church is the husband and the one in authority, and the government should come under the church, right? Now, so this is just how he's ruling and how he's running along, and things are going fine. Well, then something interesting happens in the political arena. There are two kings who are fighting with each other. We have, in England, we have Edward, and then in France, we have Philip. Okay? So, they're fighting with each other over land. They're each wanting to secede land from the other. Okay? So, in order to keep their fighting going, they each need funding. They need to somehow, pay for the soldiers and pay for the weapons and the food and the blah-de-blahs, right? So each of them decide that they are going to raise more funding for their little feud that they're having by taxing the church. So the government imposed a tax on the church in order to help. Of course, they may have said that it was to fund this little fight that they were having, but how often, even in our own time, do they tell you what they're really wanting the money for? So whatever. Anyway, so they just impose a new tax, right? They say, okay, you have a new tax and it's all on the church, okay? Well, Boniface kind of, because remember what his position is, you're under my authority. What are you doing taxing me? You're so crazy, right? So Edward's response is, Boniface's response is he puts out or threatens to put out he does put out a papal bull. And what that bull is it's a threat to any ruler who either calls for the tax to be paid or pays the tax. So on both sides, if you are a government official who's just following the emperor's new creed and saying, okay, you now owe us taxes, I'm here to collect, that person, or if you're the person that he comes to, the church authority that he comes to, and you hear, oh, well, we're supposed to pay taxes, okay. If you pay the tax, this bull says you'll be excommunicated. So if you ask for the money or you give the money, you're out. So that's what Boniface said in response to this tax that these guys had put on them. Well, Edward, his response says, he says, well, because remember, this is Christendom. Okay, this is marriage between church and state, right? So Edward says, all right, well, you can excommunicate me if you want, but you're also going to lose all your power. All your protection. I protect you. And if you're not going to pay the tax, I'm out, right? So no more gold coming, so no more money coming from the government and no more protection coming from the government. Well, Boniface looks at that and says, well, what am I going to do about that? The church is not a military power, right? And so Boniface says, all right, fine, we'll pay the tax. Okay, so Boniface basically backs down and says, all right, fine, we'll pay the tax for your, disagreement that you're having. Well, not too long after this, there was a French bishop who was taken into custody, and he was imprisoned for treason. Boniface finds out about this bishop who gets arrested, and he calls, tells the government, tells Edward, I want him immediately released. Okay, this is not okay. And if you don't release him, we're going to stop paying the taxes that we've been paying to the government. Well, I'm sorry, I said Edward, it was Philip. It was Philip that said that. So what Philip did was he called a council. Does this all sound familiar? Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. Like we are just who we are, right? So Philip calls a council. And since he's in France, it's a bunch of French bishops. He calls a council. They have a little meeting, and I mean, to great shock, they decide that Boniface is wrong. That Boniface has no say in this matter. This is a government tax and a government issue for treason. The church has no part to say in releasing him or stopping to pay the taxes. Whatever. Forget that. Boniface is wrong. Well, then Boniface responded again, and he put out another papal bull. So it's interesting. And this is not picking on the Pope. This is any person who's in authority that feels threatened. This is just what people do. They take the tools that they have in their hands and they throw them out there. And at this time, papal bulls were the authority of the church. Like if they said it, that was what it was. So every time something happened that went against the church or that they didn't like, another papal bull was out. Another papal bull was released, right? So another bull. Boniface issues another bull, the Unum Sanctum, if you want to know what it's called. That bull insisted that salvation depends on the state's submission to papal authority. Salvation depends on the state's submission to papal authority. Okay, well, it's an interesting thing to throw out there, but that's what he said. So he puts out this bull. Well, I mean, it's just like, I don't know if you all remember or have ever learned about the Persians. Like whenever we talk about the Medo-Persians taking over and getting rid of the Babylonians, whatever, whenever those kings would make a law or a proclamation, if they sealed it with their signet ring, it could not be undone. Like ever, forever and ever, it couldn't be undone. And that's kind of like what these bulls represented. I mean, whenever it gets put out there, as far as the church is concerned, not that it can't be undone. It's not that it can't be undone. I mean, it's not quite as harsh or whatever as those signet ring things for the Persians were, but definitely within the church and within the people who fall under the authority of the church, it was law. I mean, that's just what it was. And so you have to understand that, yeah, you've got, I mean, the way I'm presenting it, it's like, okay, well, Edward said this and Boniface said that. And then Philip said this and then Boniface said that, right? But really what's happening is the people are reacting to what's happening. And the people who are most loyal to the government, who are more secularized, they're going to be like, well, Edward said to pay the tax. Or Philip says to pay the tax. Whereas the people who are involved more in the church and under the authority of the church, like, well, Boniface is the Pope. He put out a bull. I mean, so you've kind of got, it's not that the people were fighting, but you understand that every time something like this is thrown out, you've got the masses that are also reacting to it. And just like with the interdict, whenever the Pope would put an interdict out on a country, it's not the ruler that cared about that. It was the people who were coming up and freaking out and making life unlivable for the ruler. So then the ruler would be like, okay, fine, we'll just do what you say, So all of these are tools of power. And basically this particular bull had nothing to do with the scriptures or spirituality or the church or God's law or anything else. This was purely a political move to throw some clout out there, because again, remember, he believes his position is this is the church and this is the government. And now the government is trying to wipe, kind of like swipe the feet out from under the church. And so what does he do? What he knows how to do. He puts out that bull, right? And the people are just like, oh, so salvation depends. Oh my gosh. I mean, the people believe it. So Philip decides that he's going to hire a lawyer. This lawyer is not, unfortunately, he falls into what most people consider the characteristic of a lawyer. He's not very scrupulous. He's of low moral character. Not all lawyers are, but this one fits the stereotype that we unfortunately put on lawyers. Anyway, this man named William, and what he was trying to do was bring Boniface before a trial. He was trying to bring him before some authorities. And in a official setting do something about, these laws, if you want to call them that he was putting out. Well, in 1303, Boniface was actually attacked by this lawyer. Well, I don't know if the lawyer was actually there, but his people, his peeps, okay? And he was held captive in a city. It doesn't matter where. And he was held captive for a while, and he was beaten. He was mistreated. And, this is not somebody who, again, not a military guy, not used to getting beat up. So he was treated pretty awful. He was rescued by some other people, doesn't matter. He was rescued, but his treatment was severe enough that within a few weeks, he never did recover from the treatment that he received from William's men. So, this event so it kind of all started with this war, or not really a war, but this bickering between England and France, and how the church sort of inserted itself into that. Well, they were kind of pulled in because they were taxed, right? That's what started it. And it all rolled down to where Boniface himself, if you're a conspiracy sort of person, Boniface is the irritant, and he was taken out basically, right? And so that event where it starts off being sort of a political, religious struggle, but then it turns into something where somebody dies at the hands of somebody else, it begins this decline of the relationship between the government and the church. And it also is a further decline within the church itself, because the church, naturally is very upset by all of this that's happening. But the next guy who comes into play, his name is Benedict the 11th. He becomes the Pope. He really wants to smooth over this thing that happened with Boniface, how Boniface died. He's trying to make it right. And that did not work out, because 8 months into his yes, his reign makes him sound like a king. He's a pope. But in his position, 8 months into his position, he was poisoned and killed. So he ate some poisoned figs. So he's gone. Well, 11 months later, this would be 1305, just for reference. A new pope was put into the position. His name is Clement V. Okay, so Clement V is put into this position, and he's French. Okay, he's a French bishop. He was the first French bishop, which I probably won't test you over. I'm just telling you. He was the first bishop from France, because remember, all of these are Roman. This is the church at Rome. So did you have a question?
All of them were what before this?
Well, Roman. They were all Italian. You could say Italian. They're all Roman. They're all of the Rome area. Okay, so France is north, and what is that? West, right? So here comes Clement, and it's believed that this was an act of simony by Philip. It's believed that Philip bought Clement's way into the papacy so that there would be French representation. Okay? Because, Philip is having to fight with Rome all the time, so now he's inserting his own perspective or his own person, right? All right. Well, when Clement so up to this point, the center of the Roman Church or Christianity was in Rome, right? The popes lived there, the churches were there, the authority was there, right? All right. When Clement was given this position, he did not go to Rome to live. He lived in France. Well, it actually wasn't part of France. But anyway, he lived in Avignon, which now is a part of France, but at that time I don't think it had been seceded yet. But whatever. Anyway, he lived in Avignon, and he had his authority, not his palace, I'm making him sound like a king. His church, his authority was based in a totally different place outside of Rome. Freaked out everybody. Like the church totally freaked out, okay? All right, so one of the things that Clement did when he went into power, interesting, this plays into that whole simony idea. One of the things he did was he reversed all interdicts and edicts against France. So, whatever power tool, whatever power had been, thrown around by whoever, whenever in history, out of Rome against France, first thing he did, abolished it all.
But only for France.
Only for France, as far as I know.
Wow.
Okay? He also had the mindset and perpetuated the mindset that, okay, so up to this point, so do you remember whenever we were talking about how after Jerusalem fell in, what year? 70 AD. Yes. After Jerusalem fell, remember that the center of Christianity moved up into Antioch, right? But you still had those major cities. You still had Alexandria, and you had Rome, and you had Antioch, and whatever. Anyway, but remember that they honored Jerusalem, even though it really, like, quote unquote, didn't exist anymore. It took some years for it to be rebuilt. But Jerusalem always had a position of high honor, and Israel has a position of high honor, and God's people have a position of high honor, right? It's always been that way. We haven't talked about it a lot since that time, but it's always been that way. One of the things that he did is he perpetuated the idea that France or the French people were at the same level or the same position of honor as God's people, as the Israelis, as the city of Jerusalem, as all these things that had been highly honored for all these years. He began and perpetuated this idea that France was becoming the chosen ones, or France was in effect equal to, if not becoming more than, the chosen ones, right? So it was interesting. It was an interesting thing that he was doing. Now, this guy, along with the next 6 popes, which if you want to look in the back of your book to know who they are, that's fine. But this guy and the next 6 popes all lived outside of Rome. They all lived in Avignon, and they had their authority based in a completely different area. So, this is a 72-year period . Okay, so this, starting with Clement, going through the next 6 popes, that's a 72-year period. Okay, this is known as, you're gonna get a kick out of this. This period of time is known as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. So remember what Babylon did? Babylon went in, and Babylon is the one who took Judah out, the 2 southern tribes. Babylon came in, removed everybody, right? And took them out, and they lived in a different place. Babylonian captivity of the papacy. It was moved out of where it should have been in Rome. Well, I'm going the wrong direction. Here's Rome. Moved up here to France, right? So it's called the Babylonian captivity. That will be important. You should know that. Okay? Well, not on every single test. Your quizzes will be like 50 or 60 questions, and you're like, ugh. Okay. All right, so I have 4 minutes. All right. Other countries, not just Rome, other countries all around, they were not on board with all of this. They were just not okay with all of the tradition and all of the just the history of the church just being uprooted and thrown off into another country. So no one was really too excited about it. We can pass through all that. All right. Because I only have 3 minutes, I'm going to have to run through some of this a little bit fast. All right. All right, I'm going to go through this with you, but it's a little bit confusing, so just try to hang out with me for just a minute, okay? Because we're going to get what I'm doing here is I'm showing you that so we have this Babylonian captivity of the papacy where everything moved out. It ends up going back. So we're going to go through superficially how it gets back into Rome, okay? All right, so you've got these 72 years. The papacy has been centered in Avignon for all this time. Then, after the 72-year period, there is a pope. His name is Gregory the 11th. Gregory the 11th, he decides that he is going to go and live in Rome. He leaves Avignon and he goes back into Rome. But soon after he gets into Rome, he dies.
You went to French too?
I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to look it up. I'm not sure. My guess would be yes, but I don't know the answer. I'd have to look it up. Now Gregory had finally brought the position of the papacy back into Rome. So when he died, the papacy or the Roman Church really wanted the next pope to live in Rome. They didn't want any of this heading off to France business. I keep going the wrong direction, heading off to France, right? So they elected a man named Urban VI. He's an Italian, and they put him in as the pope, and he was living in Rome. The problem with Urban is that he was super harsh. He was really mean to all of his men, all the people that were set around him to support him and help him. He was just not a nice person. So he actually ended up pushing off the people around him, like they didn't even want to be around him. The people that were supposed to be supporting him were kind of leaving him alone because he was mean. He was very cruel. So the people who were around Urban were like, we don't really like him. He's mean. We need to do something about him. So there's kind of this little controversy happening inside. Well, Urban's response to that, he just formed his own set of cardinals and worked with people that, that suited him more, right? So there's sort of a, thing happening inside of the church at this time. Well, while that's sort of fighting, kind of separating, kind of not playing with each other well, and it undermines the authority of the entire office whenever that happens, right? What is it? A divided house cannot stand, or something like that. That's what's happening, right? Well, while all that's happening, the people back in France, look me go in the right direction. The people back in France, they decide, well, we're going to elect a new pope. We're just going to elect a new pope that's going to live out here, right? All right, so then they do that, and, sorry?
Oh, no, they went to 2 and then they went to 3.
Yes, that's the point. So we have, let me get rid of Edward and Philip here. Their history. Just kidding. Okay. All right, so you have Urban, and he is in Rome, right? So now France decides, well, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to elect our own. They put a man named Clement into the office in France, okay? So you have Urban in Rome and you have Clement in France. Both claim to be the vicar of Christ, the ultimate authority over the church. They're both, all right? They each had their own set of cardinals who lived and worked with them. So 2 totally separate papacies, basically, each claiming authority over the other. All right, Urban, he had the support of Italy. Well, this dude's Italian, so that makes sense. So anyway, and England, and the empire, which is interesting. Clement, he had France, of course. He had let's see, who else did he have? Scotland. And he had a Spanish kingdom called Castile. Okay, so so this move, what's happening in Rome and what's happening in Avignon, it's actually beginning to divide the empire. It's dividing nations, and it's starting to form this idea. Well, I'm French, so I support Clement. I'm Scottish, so I support Clement. I'm Italian, I support Urban. Do you know what I mean? It starts to form very seriously this idea called nationalism, which we're going to talk about heavy with the Reformation. It starts.
That's when Republicans come into play?
No, not quite. No. 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 I'm not even sure I'm going to touch that. But this idea of nationalism where you are no longer supporting the church of Jesus Christ. I mean, you are. Because if you're asked point blank, what do you believe? It's not, well, I believe France. They go into and they talk about the doctrines of Christ, right? But what's happening is the mindset and the culture of the people is starting to be formed into this place where, well, I'm from France. Of course I'm going to support Clement, right? Or I'm from Italy, so of course I'm going to support Urban. And so this idea of because I live here, I support this. Not because I know the scriptures, because I love the Lord, all these other reasons, right? I want to separate myself from a corrupt society, blah, blah, all the things that we've seen before. It's a little bit different. It's a loyalty that's not solely based in a Christian perspective, right? On the surface it is, but in the heart, it's starting to be something a little bit different, okay? So anyway, we've got all these alliances. There's riots breaking out. There's all this fighting going on, blah, blah, blah. This is the funniest part about this whole thing. If you can find it funny at all, because it's a very serious subject, but I mean, it's just, anyway. So the church, right? Something has got to be done about these two fighting with each other. We've got to have a winner, right? Somebody's got to be the supreme authority. Well, a general council is called, right? Because this is how the church works. You call a general council to get rid of heresy, to disband whatever it is that's coming up against the church as a threat. The problem here is that it's another piece of the church, right? Who is claiming equal authority, right? So this general council is called. The problem is that the law of the general council is that only a pope could call a council and only the pope can finalize a decision. We've got two of them.
Oh, wow.
Like now you're in a vicious circle. Now you're a dog chasing his tail, right? Who's the pope and who's calling it and who's making the decision? Well, if you ask Urban, it's him. If you ask Clement, it's him. If you ask France, it's Clement. Do you know what I'm saying? All right. So now they have to decide who is going to be the true pope. So a majority of cardinals met. Now I don't know if this is a majority from both or if it's one or the other. That I don't know. But a majority of cardinals. My feeling is that it's both, but I don't know. Anyway, a majority of cardinals get together. They elect Pope number 3. Okay? Let's see, who did they? Alexander the Fifth. So Alexander the Fifth is now put into office as Pope. Okay, so now we've got 3, right? All right. All 3 of these popes are claiming ultimate papal authority. All are the vicar of Christ. All have a supreme authority over the other. So all we've done is create a third leg on our really, really confused horse, right? So this was the ultimate. This is finally what happened. The Council of Constance. This is important. This is something else that you will probably want to know. Maybe not for the next, but for the next exam. Okay, and this, I will not quiz you on the date, but just so you know, when they met, that's a 1.
Council.
Another council, that's right. That's what we do. We've got to get together and figure this out, right? All right. This council was called by what is known as the anti-pope, which I don't have time to get into because I'm already keeping you late. But anyway, this guy, he's called the anti-pope.
That's a T-pope.
The anti-pope, and his name is John the 23rd. John the 23rd, okay? So what he does is he abolishes the other 3 offices. One of them resigns, 2 of them are deposed. I don't know which is which, but that's what happens. One resigns, maybe this dude, because he came in at the end. I don't know who it was, but anyway, 2 of them are deposed. I imagine it's these 2, if I had my guess, but I don't know. And this guy probably was like, I'm out. So then he gets rid of all of them. Now, how did this guy have the authority to depose 2? And, well, he didn't force the resignation of the other, but how did this guy suddenly have the authority to depose these guys when they had no authority over each other? Like, how did that happen? He called for a national vote. All right? He called for, so each nation equals 1 vote. Now, are you seeing how the nationalism that had already started up here just by choosing sides, this really set it into motion? Okay? So, these guys were gotten rid of, and through the nations, a new pope was elected, Martin V, and we were Martin V, and it was finally back down to a single pope. Now,
Martin V is number 4.
well, he's number 1 now, but yes, he in this particular line, he's number 4, yes. But yeah. So, what I want you to know, okay, so I want to keep this really clear because this is where I say things and people start going, what are you talking about? So, I want to be really clear. So, the 72-year period where the papacy was moved from Rome into Avignon, that is what's called the Babylonian captivity. And you can keep this concept straight because that's what the Babylonians did. They took Judah, Jerusalem, whatever, they took the southern 2 tribes and moved them from where their home was and took them into Babylon, right? That's why it's called that. Now, this whole thing right here, which happened after that, right? This whole thing has a name too. All of this splitting and fighting and whatever. This is very important. I promise you this will be on a test. This is called the Great Papal Schism. Now, I want to be real clear about this too. We've already studied a Great Schism, right? So now we have 3 things to keep in track of. The Great Schism was the break between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, right? That happened when Constantine did his business, right? So that's the Great Schism. Then you have the papacy moving from Rome to Avignon for this 72-year period called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, right? As soon as Gregory goes back into Rome, even though he's not there for very long, he dies soon after he's in office there, then you start having dissension because Urban's mean. He's cruel to his people. You start having dissension. France is like, nobody got time for that. We're doing our own thing. And then you have fighting happening. So then when you start having 2 and 3 popes and all this dissension and all of this business happening, where it's starting to actually split nations, one against the other on some level, it's not a war, but it's mindsets, right? That is the great papal schism, centering around the Pope or the papacies, because there's more than one papacies, right? So is that clear to everybody? Great Schism, then the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, then the Great Papal Schism. Yeah? All right, I have kept you 11 minutes late. I apologize, but thank you so much for letting me get through the schism.